The Winchester rifle arrived before the man did, its barrel catching the last copper light of a dying October sun as Alberta Ford looked up from the porch steps and saw the stranger riding toward her homestead with the gun laid across his saddle like a sleeping child he was afraid to disturb. She had been shelling beans into a clay bowl, her fingers moving by rote because her mind had not truly settled in weeks, not since the letter had come from Abilene telling her that her brother James was dead. She had read that letter so many times that the creases had worn soft as cloth, and the ink had blurred in 3 places from what she told herself was the humidity, though Kansas in October had no such excuse. She was 24 years old, alone on 40 acres of hardpan prairie, and the last member of the Ford family in the territory. And now a stranger was riding up her road with James's rifle. She set the bowl aside and stood, her hand moving naturally to the shotgun she kept propped against the door frame. She did not raise it. She was not frightened exactly, but she had lived long enough on the frontier to understand that a woman alone did not greet unknown riders with empty hands. The man slowed his horse at the edge of her yard. He was perhaps 30, with a lean, sun-darkened face and a 3-day beard that came in darker than the dust coating the rest of him. He wore a plain canvas duster and a hat that had seen considerable weather. His eyes, even at distance, were a particular shade of gray-green that made Alberta think inexplicably of the Arkansas River in spring. He sat his horse well, the easy, habitual posture of a man who had spent years in the saddle, and he held the rifle with a care that struck her as deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Miss Ford," his voice carried without being loud, the way voices did in open country where there was nothing to absorb sound. "I am she," Alberta said. Her own voice was steadier than she felt. He touched the brim of his hat. "My name is Theodore Redmond. I rode with your brother for near on 2 years. I was with him in Abilene when he passed." He paused, and something moved across his face that was not practiced sympathy but something rawer, something he had not quite finished digesting. "He asked me before the end to bring this rifle home. He said you would know it." Alberta knew it. She had known it the moment she saw it outlined against the sky. That Winchester model 1873 had been their father's, and before that a prized possession carried west from Tennessee, and James had taken it when he left to punch cattle because he said a man needed something reliable. He had meant the gun, but she had always thought he meant something else too. "Will you step down?" she said, and she was surprised to hear herself say it, because every practical instinct she possessed told her to take the rifle and send the man on his way before dark. Theodore Redmond stepped down. He tied his horse to the post at the yard's edge with the practiced efficiency of a man who never wasted motion, and he walked toward her with the rifle held horizontal in both hands, an offering rather than a weapon. When he reached the bottom porch step, he stopped and held it up to her. She took it. The wood of the stock was worn smooth in the same places it had always been smooth, where her father's palm had rested, where James's palm had rested after him. She ran her thumb across the grain and felt something tighten in her chest with such violence that she had to look away for a moment, out across the flat brown grass of the yard toward the horizon. "He died easy," Theodore said quietly. "I want you to know that it was fast. There was no suffering to speak of." "The letter said a horse through him," Alberta said. "Yes, a Greenbroke bay he had no business riding, but James never could resist a horse somebody else said was unrideable." Something shifted in the stranger's face then, something that looked like the beginning of a smile and then changed its mind. "He would have wanted you to know he was laughing when it happened. He had just won $5 betting that he could ride that animal, and he was laughing about it, and then the horse put him over a fence. He didn't know anything after that." Alberta pressed her lips together. She would not cry in front of this man. She had done all her crying in the weeks since the letter arrived, alone in the house with the lamp turned low, and she had nothing left for public display. But she was grateful for the detail, the $5 and the laughter, because the letter had contained only the bare fact of the death and the name of the town and nothing else. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing it. You rode a long way. 140 miles, give or take, Theodore said. He glanced briefly at the darkening sky, then back at her, and in his expression was the particular resignation of a man who was preparing to turn around and ride back the way he came without complaint. I'll leave you to it, then. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Ford. She watched him start to turn back toward his horse, and something happened inside her that she would later describe to herself as involuntary, like sneezing, or like the way your hand jerks away from a hot stove before your mind has fully registered the danger. Except this was the opposite. This was her hand reaching toward rather than away. Mr. Redmond, she said. He stopped and turned back. Will you stay to supper? She said it quickly before she could overthink it. The night is coming on and I have stew enough for two, and she stopped. What she wanted to say was that she had questions, 100 questions about her brother, about the 2 years Theodore Redmond had known him, about what kind of man James had become out there in the world away from her. She had the letter which told her the fact of his death, and she had the rifle which was only wood and iron. But this man had known her brother alive in motion, laughing over a $5 bet. I would like to ask you about him, she finished. About James, if you would be willing. Theodore Redmond stood still for a moment in the gathering dusk, and she watched the calculation move through him, not a selfish calculation but the kind a man makes when he is trying to decide whether something is his place or not, whether his presence might do more harm than good. I would be glad to, he said finally, if you're certain it wouldn't trouble you. It would trouble me more not to ask, Alberta said. Come in. She fed his horse before she fed him, which he noted without comment, but which seemed to register somewhere behind those gray-green eyes as a thing worth noting. She pumped water into the trough and scooped grain from the sack in the lean-to, and while she worked, Theodore Redmond unsaddled his horse with the same easy efficiency and rubbed the animal down with a handful of straw, and they worked side by side in the small lean-to in a silence that was not awkward but merely purposeful. The house was small but clean, with a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room and a single bedroom behind a curtained doorway. Alberta had lived here 4 years, first with James until he left to follow the cattle drives north, then alone. She had planted a kitchen garden and kept chickens and done what needed doing, and the house showed the evidence of a person who was competent and undecorated, who spent her energy on function rather than ornament. There was a single framed photograph on the mantel above the iron stove, their parents on their wedding day, and a small bookshelf with perhaps 15 volumes standing with the particular dignity of books that had actually been read. Theodore took off his hat when he came inside and ran a hand through his dark hair, and Alberta noticed that without the hat he looked younger, or perhaps more human, the lines at the corners of his eyes less severe. He settled at the table when she gestured to it and folded his hands and watched her move around the kitchen with the still attentiveness of a man who was used to reading his environment. How did you come to ride with James? She asked. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried them to the table and sat across from him. The stew was beef and turnip, and she had made cornbread 2 days ago, and there was enough of it left that she put the remaining half loaf between them. I met him in Dodge City in the spring of '78, Theodore said. He broke a piece of cornbread and looked at it as if he were considering how to begin. I was working for the same outfit, Sutherland and Crane. We were both signed on as drovers for a herd coming up from Texas. There were 12 of us on that drive, and James was the one who made it feel like something other than work. How so? Alberta asked. He talked, Theodore said, with a slight smile that came and went quickly. Not empty talk, he told stories. At night when we were camped, he would tell stories about this farm, about your father teaching him to read by firelight, about your mother's cooking, about you chasing him out of the barn when he was trying to hide from chores. He paused. I learned the shape of your family before I knew your names. Alberta set her spoon down. He talked about me? Often, Theodore said. He was proud of you. He said you were the sensible one, the one who kept things in order. He said you had more backbone than most men he knew, and he meant it as the highest compliment. She picked her spoon back up and looked at her bowl. James had been 5 years older than her, broad-shouldered and restless and possessed of a laugh you could hear from 3 pastures over. She had been the one who stayed, not because she had no desire for anything else, but because someone had to, and James had needed to go. She had understood that about him, the way you understand something you have no choice but to understand. "Did he ever talk about coming back?" she asked. Theodore was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was careful rather than evasive. "He talked about it," he said. "He had plans. After a few more drives he was going to come back with enough saved to buy more cattle, build the herd up properly. He talked about that a lot this last year. I think he was ready to settle." Alberta absorbed this in silence. The stove ticked with heat, and outside the October wind was moving through the long grass with a sound like something breathing. She thought about James making plans in some firelit camp in Kansas, talking about coming home, and the $5 bet and the laughter, and the fact that none of his plans had arrived before him. "Tell me something else about him," she said. "Something I wouldn't know." Theodore looked up from his bowl. He had a way of looking at her directly without apology that she found simultaneously unsettling and somehow honest. "He could not carry a tune to save his life," Theodore said, "but he sang anyway every night at the top of his voice, and nobody ever told him to stop because it made everyone laugh, and laughing made the nights easier." Alberta felt the corner of her mouth move. "I know. He sang at every church social for 10 years, and the choir director used to press his hand to his forehead every time James opened his mouth. He told me that story," Theodore said. "He told it with great pride." "Of course he did," Alberta said, and this time she did smile, small and involuntary and genuine, and something shifted in the room. They sat for another 2 hours after supper, and she asked him question after question, and he answered each one with the precision of a man who understood what she was really asking, which was not simply what her brother had done but what he had been, who he had become, whether the years away had shaped him into someone she would have still recognized. Theodore described the drives in detail, the red dust of Texas and the long cold nights on the trail, the way James could gentle a spooked horse with his voice alone, the particular way he played cards, the friends he had made and lost and made again in the transient community of drovers. He described James's kindness without making it sentimental, his stubbornness without making it a flaw, his humor without making it a caricature. By the time the fire burned low, Alberta realized 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the portrait taking shape in her mind was fuller and truer than anything the letter had given her, and that she was, against all expectation, feeling something like gratitude toward this stranger, not merely for returning the rifle but for this, for all of this. The second was that it was very late, well past 10 o'clock, and a man who had ridden 140 miles did not have another reasonable riding hour left in him this night. "It's late," she said, stating the obvious because she was not sure how to phrase what she actually wanted to say. "I've kept you past time," Theodore said, and he stood, reaching for his hat from where he had set it on the table. "There is a cot in the lean-to," Alberta said. "Clean blankets. It would be foolish to ride out in this dark when there is no need for it." She said it practically, the way she said everything, which was her nature and also her protection, and she watched him weigh it and decide. "If it's no trouble," he said. "I said it wasn't trouble," she said. He slept in the lean-to, and she lay in her bed in the dark, and listened to the wind, and thought about James singing badly by firelight somewhere far away. And for the first time since the letter arrived, the grief had a shape to it that was something other than simply a void. It had texture now, substance, the particular contours of an actual life actually lived. She thought about Theodore Redmond's gray-green eyes and the careful way he had spoken, and fell asleep still thinking about it. Morning came early the way it always did, and Alberta was up before light because there was no other way to run a farm, and when she came out of the house into the cold blue dark, Theodore was already awake, sitting on the bench outside the lean-to with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had made himself from the small pot she kept hung near the door. "I hope you don't mind," he said, lifting the cup slightly. I mind less than if you had slept until noon, she said. She went to the pump and filled the big tin basin and began the morning work. And after a moment he set his coffee down and came to help, not asking if she needed it, simply identifying what needed doing and doing it, which was a thing she had not experienced in some time, and which she noticed more than she intended to. They fed the chickens, and he mended a section of fence near the chicken yard that had been leaning since August without her having had time to address it, and she worked beside him and they talked, easily and at some length, and the conversation moved from James outward into wider territory, into the land itself, and the state of things and her plans for the farm and his own life and plans, or lack of them. He was from Missouri, originally. His family had farmed along the river until his father died when Theodore was 17, and the farm had to be sold to cover debts, and he had been moving since then, following whatever work presented itself. He was 31, had never married, had no fixed address. He said all of this without self-pity, as a simple accounting of facts, and Alberta listened and understood the contours of a life shaped by necessity rather than choice. "What do you want?" she asked, at a moment when they were both leaning on the fence looking out across the flat brown land. It was a blunt question, and she asked it because she was a blunt person, and because the morning had given her enough ease with him to ask it. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he said, "Something that stays put for a while." She did not respond to that directly. She simply turned and picked up the toolbox and went on to the next thing. He stayed the morning, and then noon arrived, and she made bread and fried salt pork, and there was no natural moment for leaving, and so he stayed through noon and into the afternoon. And by the time the long October sun was reddening in the west, he had fixed the fence properly, chopped a full season's worth of firewood that had been standing in round since summer waiting for someone to split it, and repaired the hinge on the barn door that she had been lifting with both hands for 3 months. She made supper again and they talked again, and this time the conversation moved into other territory, into her own life and history, her parents, the farm, the years of managing alone, and she found herself talking with a candor she normally reserved for herself, because Theodore Redmond listened the way certain people do, as if what you were saying mattered and he was not simply waiting for his turn to speak. He stayed another night in the lean-to. The next morning she found him splitting the last of the wood rounds, working in his shirt sleeves in the cold air with a steady, unhurried rhythm, and she watched him from the porch for a moment before he noticed her. "You are going to work yourself into a meal you feel obligated to accept," she said, "and then I will feel obligated to offer it, and by this logic you may end up staying indefinitely." He stopped and looked at her, and something in his expression was careful and hopeful at once. "Is that a concern or an invitation?" he asked. Alberta considered him for a moment. "I have not entirely decided," she said, and went inside to start the coffee. The days followed one another in the way that days in late autumn do, each one a little shorter, a little colder, the land drawing inward toward itself. Theodore Redmond stayed because there was always something else to be done, another fence, the roof of the lean-to that had a soft patch he identified and replaced with good lumber, the drainage on the south side of the yard that flooded in hard rain. He stayed because the work was there, and because he was a man who completed what he started. But they both understood, without saying so, that the work was not exactly the reason. At night they sat at the table or beside the stove and talked, and sometimes they were quiet, companionable silences that built up gradually over the days like a structure you were both adding to without naming. He read from her books, or she read and he listened, and she discovered that he read well and thought carefully about what he read and could be argued with productively. She had not argued productively with anyone since James left. On the 5th day Theodore rode into the town of Harlow, 12 miles north, to buy supplies. He asked her what she needed, and she gave him a careful list, and he went and came back by mid-afternoon with everything on the list and also a paper-wrapped parcel that he set on the table without comment. "What is that?" she asked. "A book," he said. "The mercantile had a small collection. I saw this one and thought you might not have it." He said it casually, already turning to carry the flour to the pantry. She unwrapped it. It was a collection of poems published in New York, not a new edition but not badly worn either. She turned it in her hands and then looked at his back, at the wide shoulders and the easy way he moved. "Thank you," she said. He nodded without turning, and she set the book on the shelf beside the others and felt something warm moving through her chest. That evening she made coffee after supper, and they sat with cups in hand, and outside a light rain had begun, and the sound of it on the roof was the most comfortable sound Alberta had heard in months. "Tell me about Missouri," she said. "Not the hard parts, the good parts." He looked into his cup and then out the window at the rain-dark glass. "The river," he said. "The way the Missouri runs in summer, that particular color of green and brown. We used to fish it, my father and I, before things went bad when I was young." He knew the river the way some men know a language, which bend to fish in which season, which eddy-held catfish in August, which bank the turtles like to sun on. He paused. "I have not been back. I have thought about going, but I never quite made it back around to Missouri." "Why not?" she asked. "Because I think I was afraid," he said, simply and without embellishment. "Afraid it would not look the same, or that it would look exactly the same, and I would not know what to do with either one." Alberta understood this precisely. She had felt it about her own house in the weeks after James died, afraid to go into his room, afraid of what she would feel if his things were still there and what she would feel if they were not. "His room is still the same," she said, not quite knowing she was going to say it. "I have not changed anything in it." Theodore looked at her. "You don't have to explain that." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud to someone." He nodded, and his hand that was resting on the table moved perhaps an inch closer to hers, and neither of them remarked on it. On the seventh day, which was a Sunday, and therefore treated as such even in the absence of a church close enough to attend, Alberta took the Winchester down from above the fireplace where she had set it, and sat with it in her lap on the porch in the pale morning sun, and cleaned it carefully with the oil and cloth from the small kit James had kept in the leather bag attached to the rifle. Theodore came and sat in the other chair and watched her work. "He was particular about that rifle," Theodore said. "He learned it from our father," Alberta said. "Daddy used to say that a rifle is not a tool, it is a relationship. You have to tend it." "That sounds like something James would have repeated," Theodore said. "He repeated it every time he cleaned it," Alberta confirmed. "Which irritated me considerably when I was 14 and not interested in philosophical statements about firearms, but which I apparently still remember word for word." Theodore laughed. It was a full laugh, genuine and unhurried, and it was the first time she had heard it at its full volume. It transformed his face in a way that she felt as a physical sensation somewhere behind her sternum. "What?" she said, aware that she was smiling without having decided to. "Nothing," he said. "Only that you sound exactly like him when you say things like that." "I will take that as a compliment," she said. "It was meant as one," he said. She finished cleaning the rifle and set it across her knees and looked out at the yard, at the repaired fence and the split wood stacked neatly by the house and the clean lintel with the new roof section glowing pale in the sun. "You have done a great deal of work on this place," she said. "The place needed it," he said. "That is not what I said," she said. "I said you have done a great deal of work, and I wanted you to know that I see it and I am grateful." He was quiet for a moment. "You have fed me every day and let me use a warm cot and given me better conversation than I have had in 2 years," he said. "Whatever work I have done is well compensated." 2 years is a long time without good conversation," she said. "It is," he agreed, and his voice was quiet enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to catch it over the wind. She went inside to start the midday meal, and he stayed on the porch a little longer. And when she looked through the window, she could see him sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, looking out at the prairie, the way people look at things they are trying to memorize. The question of what came next began to assert itself that week with the gathering insistence of weather that is building toward something. Theodore had been there 10 days. He had done more work on the farm than Alberta could have paid a hired hand to accomplish in a month, and there was still more to do. There was always more to do, but the urgent repairs were finished, and the winter wood was stacked, and by any honest reckoning there was no longer a practical necessity keeping him. She was aware of this, and she was fairly certain he was aware of it too, because Theodore Redmond was a man who missed very little. On a cold Tuesday morning she went to town herself, taking the wagon to collect a letter she had been expecting from a land agent regarding a water rights question that had been unresolved since spring. Theodore rode alongside, not because she had asked him to, but because the road had been muddy, and the wagon had a tendency to list in deep mud, and he seemed to have decided that this was a situation that warranted accompanying her. Harlow was a small town in the manner of all frontier towns in Kansas in 1879, a single main street with a row of false-fronted buildings facing each other across packed dirt. There was a general mercantile, a livery, a hotel that was also a saloon, a small post office, a doctor's office that doubled as a barber shop in the way of frontier necessity, and a handful of other establishments that suggested the town was trying to be more permanent than it might actually prove to be. The postmistress, a woman named Dolores Hutchins who had been managing the Harlow post office for 7 years and consequently knew everyone's business in a 3-county radius, looked at Theodore with the frank and comprehensive assessment that frontier postmistresses applied to unknown men accompanying unmarried women, new to the territory. She asked him while handing Alberta her letter. "Passing through," Theodore said. He said it naturally enough, but Alberta felt him say it and felt the word passing as if it had specific weight, and she made herself read her letter while she thought about it. The water rights question turned out to be straightforward, resolved in her favor by a ruling she had not expected to come through until spring. This should have been entirely good news and largely was, but it also meant that one of the practical worries she had been managing was no longer a concern, and that meant the farm was stable in a way it had not been 6 months ago. She was aware of something building in her all through the morning in town, through the stop at the mercantile and the brief exchange with the doctor who she had been meaning to consult about a persistent cough that had been bothering her since September and which turned out to be nothing more alarming than the dry air, and through the quiet ride home beside Theodore on the wagon seat, with their shoulders occasionally touching when the road was rough. That evening, after supper and after the dishes were done, and they had settled into their evening quiet with coffee and the small sounds of the stove, she looked up from the book she was not quite reading and said, "I do not know how long you intend to stay, or whether you have plans you have not mentioned, but I want you to know that you are welcome to stay on through the winter if you want to. There is more to do in the spring. The east field needs to be broken properly, and I have been managing it with a hand plow, which is a fool's method, and there is the question of buying 2 more head if I can manage the price. You have—" She stopped. She was drifting away from what she actually wanted to say, using practical language as cover, which was her characteristic method and which she recognized was insufficient for what the moment actually required. She put the book down. "I enjoy your company," she said more plainly. "I enjoy talking to you, and not only about James. I enjoy having someone in this house who thinks about things carefully and says what they mean, and if you stayed it would not be—" She paused again. "I am not asking you to stay out of practicality," she said. "I am asking you because I want you to." Theodore set his coffee cup down with a deliberateness that suggested he had been waiting for this and had not known how to begin it himself. He looked at her with those quiet eyes. "I have been sitting here for 10 days, he said, "trying to find the honest reason I keep finding reasons not to leave, and I think you have just named it more clearly than I could have managed." "Then you will stay," she said. "If you will have me," he said. "I just said so, didn't I?" she said, and picked up her book again, but she was smiling at the page, and he could see it, and he smiled at his coffee cup, and the fire settled in the stove with a satisfied sound. The winter of 1879 came early and hard to that part of Kansas, which was not unusual, and the work of getting through it together was of a particular kind that stripped away the last of the performative formality that had governed the first weeks of Theodore's stay. There is something deeply leveling about working beside another person in genuine cold, about splitting ice from the water barrel before first light and carrying feed to the chickens through drifted snow, and lying awake listening to wind work at the walls of a house, and wondering whether the roof over the barn will hold, and then getting up at 2 in the morning to go check, because the wondering was not going to resolve itself. They were practical together first, because that was what the season required, and they were efficient in the way that two people become efficient when they learn each other's rhythms, when you know without asking that the other person has already checked the east fence, and you can go directly to the west one. When supper is half made by the time the other one comes in from the cold, and the coffee is on, and the lamp is lit. But the winter also gave them evenings, long firelit evenings with nowhere to be and nothing that could reasonably be done until morning. And in those evenings they talked with a thoroughness and depth that neither of them had previously attempted with another person. They talked about the land and what they believed about it, about the question of the Western territories and the fate of people who had lived there before the wave of settlement arrived. They talked about that with honesty and some discomfort, because Alberta had grown up on land that had not always been available for homesteading, and Theodore had ridden enough of the West to understand what the cattle drives and the settlers were pushing against. "My father used to say the land does not belong to anyone," Alberta said one evening. "He meant it in the sense of humility, I think, that no man should be proud of his acreage. But I have come to wonder if he was saying something more than he knew. It is a thing I have thought about on the trail," Theodore said, "riding through country that used to be entirely different, that was different 20 years ago in living memory, and now it is ranges and fences and towns." He looked at the fire. "I do not know what the right answer is. I know that people have been pushed out and pushed out wrongly, and that what has happened to the Comanche and the Cheyenne and others is a thing that will be on the conscience of this country for a long time." "Yes," Alberta said, "it will." She looked at him. "I appreciate that you say that." "I would not say it if I did not believe it," he said. These conversations, about the hard things as well as the easy things, were part of what built between them in those winter months, something that was trust in its most structural form, the kind that is not merely emotional but is built from accumulated evidence of character. Alberta trusted Theodore not simply because she liked him, though she did, more than she had liked anyone in a long time, but because she had observed him over weeks and months, and he was consistent in a way that mattered to her, consistent in his kindness and his honesty and his willingness to do what was difficult without requiring recognition. He trusted her too, and she could see it in the way he gradually stopped measuring his words quite so carefully, stopped being quite so precise and spare with himself, allowed his humor to surface more freely, allowed his uncertainty and his quieter doubts to show without apology. He had a dry wit that emerged more and more as the winter went on, a way of making observations about the absurdities of frontier life that made her laugh at moments she had not expected to. There was the evening in December when he came in from the barn with his hat entirely white with snow and his expression one of studied dignity, and said, "The east wall of the barn has a significant structural disagreement with the direction of the current wind," and she laughed so hard she had to set down her sewing. There was the morning she came out of the house to find him in a comprehensive argument with the rooster, who had established a habit of aggressive territorial display whenever Theodore crossed the yard, and she watched him address the bird with a long and formal speech about mutual respect and the rites of passage that made her have to press her apron to her face to muffle her laughter. These were small things, and they were also not small at all, because laughter in winter, real laughter, unforced and frequent, was its own form of warmth, and warmth was a thing that Alberta Ford had been without for too long. There came a night in late January when a storm came on so fast and so violent that the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind drove the snow horizontal, and there was no question of Theodore going to the Linta, which was, during severe weather, simply too cold to sleep in safely. He slept by the fire on the rug with a blanket, and the following morning they both treated this as an entirely unremarkable circumstance. But the intimacy of having another person breathing in the same room all night was something that settled in Alberta's chest and stayed there. She lay awake for some time that night listening to him breathe and to the storm outside, and thinking about the particular quality of not being alone in a house during a storm, how different it was from being alone in a house during a storm, and how she had grown so accustomed to the latter that she had stopped noticing its weight until the weight was lifted. By February, she was aware that what she felt was something she was going to have to address. She was not, by nature, a person who let important matters accumulate without resolution. She had always dealt with things directly, whether they were fence problems or financial problems or emotional ones, and she recognized that she had been managing her feelings about Theodore Redmond with the same avoidance strategy she had used on the east fence, which was to deal with everything around it, and hope the problem resolved itself. And the east fence had not in fact resolved itself. It had leaned further and required exactly the direct intervention she had been postponing. He had kissed her once, in early February, which had not been planned by either of them, and which had happened in the natural consequence of a moment that had built toward it quietly over weeks. They had been standing in the kitchen, and she had said something that made him laugh, and his hand had come up to brush a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture of such naturalness that she had barely processed it as a distinct action. And then he had kissed her, gently, briefly, and then pulled back and looked at her with an expression that was asking a question. She had answered by stepping toward him rather than away, and what had followed was not grand or theatrical, but was quiet and warm and deeply felt. And afterward they stood in the kitchen with the stove ticking and the cold outside, and she had his hands in hers, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I should tell you," he said eventually, "that I have not been passing through for some time." "I know," she said. "I have not thought of you as passing through for some time." I want to say he stopped and started again, because Theodore, for all his ease with her, still became careful at important moments, still chose his words. "I want to say clearly that I am not a man who does things halfway, and if this is a thing, I mean to be here for it completely. But I need you to know that too, so that you know what you're accepting." "What does completely mean to you?" she asked. "Everything," he said. "Building something here, being whatever this farm and this life requires, being with you." He paused. "Getting married if you would want that, if you would have me." She looked at their joined hands for a moment, then she looked up at him. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am working my way toward it," he said. "Yes." "Then work faster," she said, "because I have already decided." He smiled at that, slow and full. "Alberta Ford," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." They were married in March of 1880 in Harlow, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church that had been established the previous year. Dolores Hutchins from the post office attended, along with the doctor and his wife, and the family of a neighboring homesteader named Carver, who had been Alberta's closest neighbors for 3 years, and whose 2 teenage children had sometimes come to help with heavy work. The minister was a young man named Pastor Enright, who had arrived in Harlow 6 months prior from Illinois, and was still somewhat daunted by the size of the sky. The ceremony was short and sincere, and when Theodore said the words, he said them looking directly at her in the way he did everything, completely and without reservation, and she said her own words with the same steadiness she brought to everything she undertook. The gold band he put on her finger had been bought at the mercantile, not elaborate, but solid and well-made, and she wore it with the particular pride of a woman who understood the weight of what it represented. Afterward there was cake at the Carver homestead, which was larger and better suited to gathering, and Theodore was welcomed by the assembled community of Harlow with the particular pragmatic warmth of frontier people who accepted others based on what they observed and what they heard. And what they had heard and observed of Theodore Redmond over the preceding months was favorable. He was a man who helped when help was needed and did not make himself important about it, and in a small frontier community that was a kind of currency. Alberta watched him talk to the Carver brothers about spring planting and felt something she recognized slowly as contentment, not the contentment of having no problems, because there were always problems, but the contentment of fundamental rightness, of being in the correct place doing the correct thing. They rode home in the wagon in the late afternoon of their wedding day, through the pale new green that was beginning to show at the edges of the road where the grass was coming back, and the sky was very large and very clear, and the light was the particular amber of early spring. "Well," Theodore said, after they had ridden in companionable silence for a while. "Well," Alberta agreed. "Mr. and Mrs. Redmond," he said. "Mrs. Alberta Ford Redmond," she said, because she had decided she was keeping Ford, and he had nodded without hesitation when she mentioned it the week before. "Mrs. Alberta Ford Redmond," he repeated, and said her name with a precision and warmth that she felt land in her chest like something coming home. That spring, they broke the east field properly with a proper plow and 2 good draft horses that Theodore found through an acquaintance of the Carvers, and they planted wheat and a kitchen garden that was twice the size of the old one, because Theodore had an instinct for growing things that surprised her. He had learned it along the river in Missouri as a boy, he said, and the knowledge had simply been waiting for ground to apply itself to. He was a natural farmer, it turned out, which was not always a thing you could have predicted from a man who had spent years as a drover. He understood soil in the same patient way he understood everything, attending to it carefully, reading it, responding to what he found rather than imposing a predetermined plan. He and Alberta worked together in the fields with the easy synchrony they had developed over the winter, and the farm began to take a shape that neither of them could have managed alone. In June, Theodore made a trip to Abilene to settle the last of his affairs there, returning a borrowed saddle to the man he had borrowed it from before riding to Alberta's homestead, and collecting a small amount of back pay owed him by the Sutherland and Crane outfit, which was winding down its operations in the territory as the cattle drive era began its slow decline in the face of the railroad and the closing range. He was gone 4 days, and Alberta discovered in those 4 days that she had entirely forgotten what it had felt like to be completely alone in the house, because it felt now like a different and unfamiliar thing, the absence of him, a specific shape, rather than simply a general condition. He came back on the 4th evening with the saddle settled and the wages collected, and a letter he had arranged to have waiting for him at the Abilene post office, a letter from an old friend of his father's in Missouri who still lived along the river and who had written at Theodore's request to give news of the old country, as it were. He read it to Alberta at the table, and they talked about it, and she asked questions about Missouri and he answered them, and at the end of the conversation he said, "I would like to go back someday, not to stay, just to see it." "Then we will go," Alberta said. "When things are settled enough here for us to leave for a week, there is no reason we couldn't." He looked at her as if the simplicity of the solution had not occurred to him, which she suspected was a function of having spent too many years thinking of himself as someone without the resources or the grounding to undertake such a thing. "You would come with me," he said. "Where else would I go?" she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat that way for a while in the summer evening with the window open and the sound of the wheat in the field beyond the yard, and it was a good evening. The summer was busy in the way that farm summers always are, constant and demanding and physically exhausting, and somehow still deeply satisfying. They were building the farm in a deliberate and thoughtful way, adding the 2 cattle she had planned, and then a third because a fourth became available at a price that was difficult to refuse, and repairing and improving the barn so that it was a proper structure rather than the collection of provisional decisions it had been before. They had a neighbor dispute in August, the kind that was common in the territory, concerning the water rights on the creek that ran along the south edge of Alberta's land. A man named Percy Lund had moved onto the adjacent property in the spring, and had ideas about the creek that conflicted with the ruling Alberta had received in the fall. Theodore handled it with a methodical patience that Alberta admired greatly, spending 2 afternoons with the relevant documents and 2 more afternoons in conversation with Lund, calm and fair, but absolutely clear about what the documents established, and the matter was resolved without either violence or a lawsuit, which was better than many such disputes in Kansas in 1880 managed. "You were very good at that," Alberta told him in the evening after the matter was settled. "I merely read the documents," Theodore said. "You read them to him twice," Alberta said, "and explained them patiently without making him feel foolish, which was the difficult part." "He is not a bad man," Theodore said. "He simply was not reading the situation correctly." "Most conflicts are that," Alberta agreed. In September, Alberta told Theodore she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen directly, which was her way, and she watched his face move through surprise and then something very deep and very still, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully, with the particular care of someone who suddenly understood something important about the fragility and importance of what they were holding. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said, her face against his shoulder. "I am excellent." "Good," he said, "good." He held her a little longer. "I am going to be a father," he said, somewhat wonderingly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "You are," she confirmed. "I am terrified," he said. "That is appropriate," she said. "I am also terrified." "Good," he said, "good. We will be terrified together." They were. They also read every relevant volume they could find and consulted the doctor in Harlow, who was competent and reassuring. And they prepared the house and the routine with the same practical thoroughness they brought to everything. And when Theodore's anxiety expressed itself as doing too many things for Alberta that she was entirely capable of doing herself, she told him with great directness to stop hovering. And he stopped hovering while remaining quietly attentive in a way that was entirely different from hovering, and which she appreciated. The winter of 1880 was easier than the winter of 1879, not because it was less harsh, but because there were 2 of them to manage it, and the farm was in better order, and they had more resources and more knowledge of the particular character of their 40 acres in cold. They added a wood-burning stove in the bedroom, a luxury that had been impossible to justify the year before, and Alberta, as her pregnancy advanced, found the warmth essential and was grateful for Theodore's insistence on acquiring it before the cold came. He read to her in the evenings, sitting in the chair beside her own, the 2 of them close in the warm light with the sound of the wind outside, and she listened to his voice moving through the pages of whatever they were reading, and felt that this was a thing she wanted to sustain indefinitely, this specific configuration of warmth and companionship, and the particular sound of a voice she had come to love. She loved him. She had known this with increasing clarity since the winter before, but she said it plainly for the first time in October, simply and without preamble, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely unrelated, because it was true, and because she did not believe in leaving true things unsaid indefinitely. He had put down whatever he was holding and looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something more profound than surprise, the expression of someone receiving something they had hoped for so much that they had been afraid to trust the hope. "I love you, Alberta," he said. "I have for a very long time." I have been trying to show you rather than say it because I was afraid saying it would. He stopped. I was afraid of many things, he said honestly. Stop being afraid, she said. Say it. I love you, he said, completely and permanently. I want you to know that. Good, she said. Then we are both on the same page, and she returned to whatever she had been doing, and he sat there for a moment with a smile on his face that she could see from the corner of her eye and which made her own smile difficult to suppress. Their son was born in February of 1881, a cold, clear Tuesday morning, with the doctor attending and Theodore present, which was not the universal custom, but was Alberta's decision, and she had made it firmly, and the doctor had accommodated it. The birth was difficult enough to be frightening and straightforward enough to end well, and when it was over and the baby was placed in Alberta's arms, she looked at the small, furious red face and felt something that did not have an ordinary name. Theodore was standing at the bedside, pale from the hours of waiting and watching, and he looked at his son with an expression that Alberta would think about for the rest of her life, that complete and undefended wonder, the face of a man who was not trying to be anything other than exactly what he was, which was a father seeing his child for the first time. "Hello," Theodore said softly to the baby, as if making an introduction. The baby's eyes, which were still working out what eyes were for, moved vaguely in his direction. "I am your father," Theodore told him. "I am going to learn how to do this properly. I want you to know I am committed to it." "He cannot understand you," Alberta said. "He might be able to tell the intent," Theodore said. "I will grant you that," Alberta said. They named him James William Redmond. James for Alberta's brother, because she had made that decision long before the child arrived. William for Theodore's father, because Theodore had not known his father long enough and had not had occasion to keep him present in the world before now. James William, who arrived in February like a second winter, loud and demanding and utterly necessary. The first months were the kind of exhausting that reorients your entire understanding of the word, and Alberta and Theodore managed them the way they managed everything, together, and with a distribution of labor that was practical and flexible, rather than governed by any fixed idea about what was one person's job versus another's. Theodore fed the farm and did the outside work, and when he came in, he took the baby so that Alberta could sleep, and Alberta fed the baby and managed the house, and when Theodore had been working since before first light, she made him sit down and eat before she would let him start the next task. They were, in the way of people who have built something real together, a functioning unit. And while the first months with James William were brutal in the specific way that early parenthood is brutal, they were also something else, something binding and vivid and profoundly felt. Spring came again, the second spring of their marriage, and James William was old enough to be carried in a sort of sling Alberta had fashioned from a length of canvas, and she wore him against her chest while she worked in the kitchen garden, and he looked out at the world with the philosophical gravity of an infant who is still assembling a coherent picture of existence. Theodore would come in from the field and take the boy from her, and carry him through the rows of plants, and narrate what he was looking at in the low, patient voice he used with things that could not speak back. This was the shape of their life, built piece by piece over years, the farm growing more productive and more settled. The house expanded when James William needed more room, and then expanded again when Alberta told Theodore in the spring of 1883 that a second child was coming, and this one arrived in November, a girl they named Clara Ruth, Ruth for Alberta's mother. Clara was not like her brother. Where James William had been loud and physically insistent from the first day, Clara was still and observant, her dark eyes taking in everything with an attention that made visitors uncomfortable in the way that very watchful babies sometimes do. Theodore said she reminded him of Alberta, which Alberta took as the compliment it was intended to be. In the spring of 1884, when James William was 3 years old and Clara not yet 6 months, Theodore kept his promise and they made the trip to Missouri. They left the children with the Carver family, who had by this time become something close to family themselves, and they rode east together on the train, which by 1884 had made the trip not only possible but merely a matter of days rather than weeks. The Missouri River was green and brown, and moving with exactly the authority that Theodore had described by firelight in the house on cold evenings, and they stood on its bank in the early May morning, and Theodore was quiet for a very long time. "Is it what you remembered?" Alberta asked. "It is exactly what I remembered," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "And I did not know until this moment whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing." "Is it good?" she asked. He took her hand and held it. "It is very good," he said. "I needed to see it still here." They spent 4 days in Missouri, visiting the land that had been his father's, which was now a working farm owned by a family who let them walk it, and visiting his father's old friend, a man named Harrison Webb who was in his 70s and remembered Theodore's father clearly, and talked about him with an affection that clearly meant something to Theodore. On their last evening in Missouri, sitting on the porch of the Webb house with the river visible at the bottom of the slope, Theodore said to her, "Thank you for this." "I told you we would come," she said. "You did," he said. "I should have believed you sooner." "You should believe me about most things," she said. "I have a good record." He laughed, the full laugh she had first heard on the porch of her farmhouse a lifetime ago. "You do," he said. "You have an excellent record." They returned to Kansas in time for the spring planting, and James William had not been traumatized by 4 days with the Carvers, and Clara had apparently charmed every person in the Carver household and been entirely unaffected by her parents' absence, and the farm was in good order, and the wheat was coming in, and it was a good return. The years that followed were marked by the things that mark years when you are building a life, the good harvests and the difficult ones, the calves born and the ones lost, the community of Harlow growing slowly around them, new families arriving each year on the land, new buildings going up, a second church and a proper school that James William attended and Clara after him. They were part of this community in the way that people become part of something when they stay in it long enough and invest in it consistently, attending the gatherings and the difficult meetings about water rights and land disputes, contributing to the practical mutual aid that held frontier communities together. Theodore became known in Harlow and the surrounding territory as a man of considered judgment, the kind of person that neighbors came to when they needed a dispute arbitrated or a complicated decision navigated, and he did this work without making it a position or requiring anything in return for it. Alberta was known as a woman of remarkable competence and directness, which were both meant as compliments in the particular social context of frontier Kansas, and were received by her as such. They were happy. It was not a happiness without difficulty, because no happiness of substance is without difficulty, but it was the deep, tidal kind, the kind that persists through hardship because it is founded on something structural rather than something circumstantial. On a September evening in 1885, when Alberta had been working on the household accounts at the table and Theodore had come in from checking the south fence line and sat down and poured himself a cup of coffee, and they were sitting in that particular domestic quiet that was the texture of their life together, she looked up at him across the table and thought about the first evening he had sat at this table, dusty from the road, with James's rifle and James's stories. And she thought about all the evenings since then and the shape of everything they had built. "What are you thinking?" Theodore asked, because he had learned to read her silences the way her father had read the river. "I was thinking about the day you arrived," she said. He looked up. "What about it?" "I was thinking that I almost did not ask you to stay for supper," she said. "I almost just took the rifle and said thank you and watched you ride away." "I know," he said. "I could see you deciding." "Could you?" she said. "Yes, you have a very particular expression when you are deciding something against your first instinct." "Do I?" she said. "You press your lips together," he said, "and you look at the middle distance for a moment and then you say the thing." She considered this. "That is accurate," she said. "I was grateful when you said the thing," he said. She looked at him across the table. this man who had ridden 140 miles to return a dead man's rifle, and had stayed because she asked him to explain the man he had known, and who was now her husband and the father of her children, and the person she talked to about everything, and the person whose particular presence in a room she had learned to be aware of the way you are aware of warm light. And she felt the full weight of how different everything would be if she had not pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance and then said the thing. "So was I," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her palm up and held his hand, and outside the September evening was warm, and the wheat was ready to harvest, and William was asleep in his room, and Clara was asleep in hers, and the Winchester rifle that had been her father's and James's hung above the fireplace where she had put it when she first set it in the house, cleaned and oiled and in its proper place, and the photograph of her parents was still on the mantel. And there were more books on the shelf now, many more, and the rooms of the house were full of the evidence of two people living their lives together in earnest, and the stove ticked with heat, and the evening moved toward night, and everything was as it should be. She had asked him to stay so she could ask him about her brother. He had stayed because the asking had given him permission to want something he had not been certain he deserved. And from that particular exchange, that single decision made in the October dusk with a rifle in her hands and grief in her chest, they had built this, all of this, the farm and the family and the years of evenings and the shared labor and the trust and the love. In the spring of 1886, when the planting was done and the days were lengthening into real warmth, Alberta stood in the east field that Theodore had broken properly in their first spring together, and that had now produced 5 consecutive harvests, and she looked back at the house and saw Theodore coming out the door with Clara on his hip and William running ahead of him down the path, and she felt something in her chest that she could only call full. He saw her and raised a hand, and she raised hers back, and Clara, who had inherited her mother's observant eyes, watched this exchange with the philosophical seriousness of a 2-year-old, and then pointed at Alberta and said something in the private language she was still translating into ordinary words. "Yes," Theodore said to her, in the patient voice he used to narrate the world to children who were still learning it. "That is your mother. She is standing in the east field. That is the wheat coming up. She planted most of it herself." William ran ahead to Alberta, and she caught him, and he launched into a detailed account of a circumstance involving the rooster that had apparently occurred that morning, and which he felt was of significant political importance. And she listened and responded and looked over his head at Theodore walking toward her with Clara in his arms, and in his face was everything she had named and everything she had not found words for yet, and she thought there would be time. There would be all the time they needed. This farm and this life were not going anywhere. The rooster, for what it is worth, had by this time achieved something like a grudging truce with Theodore, though he still occasionally made a territorial comment when Theodore crossed the yard at an angle the rooster found presumptuous. Theodore still occasionally addressed him with formal speeches about right-of-way. William found both parties in this negotiation deeply entertaining. Clara, who had at the age of 18 months simply walked directly at the rooster with complete authority until it backed down, had no difficulty with him whatsoever. This was also, Theodore noted, exactly what her mother would have done. The year continued to unfold in the particular rhythm of a prairie farm in a good season, and the community of Harlow continued to grow and change around them, and the world was moving, the railroad spreading and the territory shifting, and the long era of the open cattle drives winding down in the face of fences and homesteads, and all of it continued, and the Redmond farm continued within it, steady and productive and built on something real. Theodore had come to return her dead brother's rifle, and had stayed because she asked him to explain the man he had known, and he had explained James to her so thoroughly, and with such care that James had become present again in her life, in a way she had not thought would be possible, and she had given Theodore something in return that he had not known he was looking for, which was a place and a reason and a person to be steady for. And they had found in each other something neither of them had expected to find in the way they found it, which was in grief and practicality, and 140 miles of Kansas road, and a single decision made at dusk, with a rifle in her hands and a question asked rather than the thanks and the goodbye that would have been easier. She had asked the question. He had answered it. And then neither of them had quite been able to stop talking, and that, she sometimes thought, was really how it had begun. Not in romance, not in calculation, not in anything planned or deliberate, but in the simple fact of a story that needed to be told by someone who had been there, and someone who needed to hear it. And in the space between the telling and the listening, something had grown that was now as permanent and as fundamental as the wheat in the east field, as the child running toward her through the spring light, as the rifle above the fireplace with her family's initials worn smooth into the wood, as the hand that reached for hers across a table and found it, and as the voice she still listened for every morning, waking to the sound of the stove and the cold air and the particular silence of a house where someone else was already up and already working, already in the world and already hers. She caught James William's hand and they walked together toward Theodore, who stood waiting in the early spring light with Clara in his arms and his eyes on Alberta. And the sky above the Kansas plains was very wide and very blue, and the wheat was coming up clean and even in the east field, and the house behind them stood solid and true against the horizon, and all of it was theirs, all of it was good, and there was still a great deal of living left to do.